On this episode of China Throughlines, we're actually going to be talking to two guests. Yifei Li is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU Shanghai, and Judith Shapiro is the Chair of the Environmental Politics Program and the Director of the Masters in Natural Resources and Sustainable Development at American University in Washington, D.C. And Yifei and Judith have recently published a fantastic and important new book called China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. And so they've agreed to join us to field some questions and talk a little bit about this exciting new book. So the first question that I wanted to ask both Yifei and Judith is, how did your collaboration on this book come about? How did you decide to work together, write this new study?
We met at one of those academic conferences. I think we were on the same panel. And then I think we saw each other at another academic conference and we were on the same panel. And I think at that point, Yifei was about to return to Shanghai, where he's a professor at NYU Shanghai. And I was about to do a short-term teaching stint at Schwarzman College. And as we got to know each other, we realized we'd both been thinking about environmental authoritarianism for different reasons and in different ways. And more, I think there was a workshop then, and we sort of looked at each other and said, you know what, this is a book here. And we'd never worked together before. And so it's always like a little bit of a risk, I guess. But this turned out to be the best risk I've ever taken, because just the fun of working together was, with him being in China and me being in the US and working together on these Google documents, right? I would work during the day and then I go to sleep and I'd wake up and I'd think, oh, wow, look at all this stuff Yifei has done. And I'd respond, and we had such a great synergy. And of course, we took the lead at different parts of the book, but then I think almost all of the book has a strong imprint from both of us.
Yifei, is there anything that you'd like to add about the collaboration?
Yeah, I think, there's sort of us getting to know each other and us sort of exchanging ideas about authoritarian environmentalism. And that certainly, like Judy pointed out, over a few years, we got to know each other, our own backgrounds, and the stuff that we care about. And most importantly, perhaps, the observations that we too were making independently about environmental protection in China. In particular, I think, one of the main intellectual motivations for working together between the two of us was that we both were hearing a lot in the West with regard to, on the one hand, frustrations with democracies, especially when democracies weren't able to produce the kind of effective environmental responses that we wanted to see, or most environmentalists, environmental scholars wanted to see. And on the other hand, there seems to be the speculation that if democracies can't cut it, why don't we turn to the authoritarian alternative? There seems to be growing interest in exploring the idea without actually producing an empirically based and evidence-based account of how authoritarian political systems actually take on environmental challenges. And we felt that without a grounded analysis of the matter, it simply is not good enough for various commentators and observers to say that, oh, we need to look at China, look at their plastic bag ban, look at their renewable energy promotion policy. Well, these are great examples, but these don't reflect the systematic pattern of power that we both felt needed to be better articulated. And it's really that intellectual motivation, and also the two of us having a lot of good synergy just between us that led us to begin to work together.
Mm-hmm.
The other motivation that I think we had was not only what Western observers were saying about the failure of democracies to deal with global environmental challenges, but also for a number of years, I've been hearing about ecological migration in the western parts of the country. And when you first hear the phrase ecological migration, it sounds like it must be something good, you know? And then I came to understand that it really was forcible relocations of nomads, which the state has been trying to do for centuries and centuries. Only now they're able to cloak it in this green agenda, which makes it even harder for these people who are trying to preserve their heritage and their culture to resist. And so there were a lot of missteps too involved with that, a lot of misunderstandings, I think, on the part of the state about the co-creation of some of these ecosystems between the people and the grasslands, to say, oh, you know, your little hooved animals are tearing up the grasslands, without really understanding that precisely it is those animals that have kept the grasslands looking as they have. So that was another motivation for the book.
Right. So, Judith, your comment just now about ecological migration points to a concept that I have grown increasingly interested in my own research, and that is environmental justice. So could the two of you talk a little bit about environmental justice and the way that you have applied that concept in your analysis in the book?
Sure. That's such a great question, Micah. Thank you for bringing that up. I think this issue of environmental justice is, whether implicitly or explicitly stated in the book, almost everywhere in all of the chapters. We progress from the industrial east of China to the western borderlands of the country, and then to the Belt and Road on the Eurasia continent, Africa and beyond, and then ultimately to the global commons. So that's sort of the spatial progression of the chapters. But in each of the chapters, environmental justice has its unique set of meanings. In the industrial east, it's about state power penetrating into citizen lives. What does these environmental initiatives mean for people of low socioeconomic status, for people who are already on the margins of the society? They seem, in our case analyses, they seem to have been pushed even further aside to the shadows of the society. And then if you look at the Western borderlands, once again, still an environmental justice issue, but taking on different meanings in the sense that ethnic minorities continue to experience more hardship, in ethnic minorities being subject to even more draconian state interventions into how they should live their lives. And then outside of China, on the Belt and Road, similar issues, but manifests differently in the sense that a lot of the Belt and Road partner countries with China are now having to deal with the influx of coal-fired power plants, and yet the arrival of these technologies are framed as somehow green development, win-win development. So we try to unpack some of these issues there, but even more so in the global commons when China aggressively ventures into the outer space to try to mine the moon, to try to intervene into global trade norms, and yet at the same time maintaining an environmental cloak to a lot of these initiatives. I think it comes in the form of a lot of injustice to people who are on the receiving end, to communities who are on the receiving end of Chinese environmental power.
Judith, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Well, I was just thinking that Yifei gave us the spatial structure of the book, but one of the analytical structures is that for each of those spaces, we try to identify tools that the government tends to rely on, and these tools are often sweep up vulnerable people. So just to give you a taste, I won't be able to list them all, but for the developed East, we talked about campaigns and crackdowns. Obviously, you know, when you have a campaign and a crackdown, there's innocent people will often feel the brunt of that. Or target setting, which is really a fascinating thing because it's so specific. They say, you know, by this time this year, there'll be 1.03 fewer blah, blah, blahs, you know, and so these poor local officials are trying to meet this target. And, you know, one story that I'm really fond of in the book is about an air pollution target in Hunan province. And it turned out that when the farmers were using their threshing machines, that created huge spikes in the pollution readings. And so the local officials, out of fear of not meeting the targets, banned threshing machines, and all of this grain got wasted. So that's an example of how these tools end up going awry. We also talked about one-size-fits-all policymaking, which that actually Yifei took the lead in that. It was mostly about afforestation and trying to plant a whole lot of poplars in a certain area by a certain date and just show that you did it, and then who cares whether the poplars continue to live, and who cares whether it's actually, a vibrant forest or simply a monoculture. And then green grabbing is a really interesting one as well, because that gets into the issue of dams. And we all know how controversial the dams are. We make the point in the book that for local people who are being relocated for a dam, it becomes very hard to give a justification for resisting that dam if the country is saying this is part of our promise to the Paris Agreement to have a certain percentage of renewable energy by a certain date, or to achieve, peak whatever by a certain date. So it disempowers people even more who are trying to resist these kinds of mega projects.
Could you explain the term green grabbing? Because that might be one that people who are watching wouldn't be familiar.
Yeah, it's a development of the term land grabbing. And so green grabbing is really like land or resource grabbing, but in the name of environmental protection.
Okay, I see. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about as well are the roots of this phrase that is now ubiquitous in China, that is Shengtai Wenming, or ecological civilization. How did that term originate? And what do you make of it in your own sort of thinking about China's current environmental policies?
I guess I can begin by sort of commenting rather briefly on where the term came from, and Judy can add on add more about how we view this term in the context of environmental protection in China on the ground. I think the term itself is the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to extend the Marxian stages of historical development theory. Now, Marx stated that human societies evolve in stages, from agricultural societies to pre-capitalist societies to capitalist societies, and then socialism, and ultimately communism. And Marx had these ideas about how the previous stage always sets up for the next stage because of the internal contradictions within the previous stage. The Chinese Communist Party, and especially the party school theorists, starting from the early 2000s, seem to have invested a lot of their resources in trying to expand that theory to suggest that China not only follows this trajectory of development as Marx has described in some of his earlier works, but also is in the process of actively making history such that China becomes the next civilizational leader in producing the newest and the latest stage of development, which then they called ecological civilization. The idea really has a lot of intellectual and cultural baggages in it, in the sense that intellectually it's marketed and framed as an extension of Marxism, but also culturally, it frames China as a worthy civilizational leader in the world. That in some ways, the Chinese Communist Party always uses the phrase, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And that in a lot of ways connects with the idea of rejuvenation, the fact that China had a glorious past, but then there was the Opium War, and then the civilization somehow fell into a state of humiliation, as the official historians would describe, and now seems to be a revival of the nation in that particular regard, in leading the world into what they call ecological civilizations. I think both of these sources of meaning seem to define this rather complex notion of ecological civilization.
And that's
I don't have that
absolutely,
much to add. Yeah, yeah, I think that was
Go ahead.
really a great discussion. The other point to make is that the Chinese leadership has come to take environmental problems very seriously, and that goes to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, because you could make an argument about the rising middle class, and now they all have these basic material goods, but they're worried about whether it's safe to eat their food. They know that they have cancers and tuberculosis, other kinds of lung diseases, and they're afraid to drink their water. And so this discontent, particularly among the middle classes, about the level of pollution is very high. So the Communist Party, as I see it, knows they have to deal with this pollution or their legitimacy is at stake. When you add to that their ability to see in the long term what the impacts of climate change will be for the country in terms of sea level rise and glacier melt and extreme weather events and all of that, which maybe the country is a little bit ahead of the ordinary Chinese person on that. So, you know, they need a formula to show that they're dealing with the environment, and yet they don't want to simply import a Western term like sustainable development. They want to show, as Yifei was arguing, that they can put a Chinese twist on it and put the stamp of Chinese greatness and Chinese civilization onto it. But what it actually means, like, nobody knows. It's like, you know, harmonious society, or what do these things mean? If you ask somebody on the street, what is ecological civilization? They don't know. They just know it's good for China and it's about China's reputation and China's greatness.
Yeah, I mean, it's a term that I, in the past, thought of as a kind of empty slogan he was kind of alluding to that didn't really mean anything. But after hearing Yifei's explanation and looking at the book, it's actually a concept that is quite fascinating in its origin, quite striking in the way that it's connected to currents in Chinese Marxism, right? And this sort of stage theory of history. It's also quite striking the way in which China's leaders have become acutely aware of environmental problems over the past dozen years or so. And this leads me to a question that's specifically for Judith about the relationship between China Goes Green and a book that she published now almost 20 years ago in 2001 called Mao's War Against Nature. And Mao's War Against Nature, who, for people who don't know about this book, which has now become kind of a classic in the field of Chinese environmental history, of China's environment between 1949 and roughly 1976, which historians refer to as the Mao era. And the image that she presented of that era, based on all sorts of evidence, is that that period witnessed an acceleration of environmental degradation throughout China for a variety of reasons that she discusses in the book. And so the question that I wanted to ask for Judith was how China's move towards what is often referred to as green authoritarianism over the past decade or so is related to Mao's War Against Nature during the period between 1949 and 1976. Has there been just a complete abandonment of the patterns that you see during the Mao era over the past decade, or do you see certain continuities, whether positive ones or ones that have more negative implications for the environment?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, so that book was also organized in a 4-part structure, as I recall, from 20 years ago. And the themes that I focused on there were political repression, what I call dogmatic uniformity, which is a one-size-fits-all kind of policymaking, the willingness to forcibly relocate and reorder populations, and there was another one, political repression, I think. And so those four themes are alive and well in China today, absolutely. And even this war-making language we found came out, you know, war against, if they remind me, war against pollution.
Air pollution, yeah.
Embarking on war against, yeah. So this militarized language, but also, as we've already been describing, using now the green discourse to relocate nomads, using this dogmatic uniformity to say, we're gonna hit this target by this year, you know, no excuses, everybody's gonna get swept up in it, and we're all gonna, you know, launch a kind of a campaign to meet the target. This is all very similar kind of mentality. And then the fact that still officialdom is looking up rather than looking down. There's very little so-called supervision by the masses, which is the old Maoist term. And we saw that problem. We see it with the target setting, right, where the officials are trying to please those above them. But we even saw it with the COVID outbreak initially, where the local officials were afraid to tell the leadership that there was a really bad virus, and instead they silenced the doctors who were warning about it, and they shut down chat groups that were talking about it, and so on and so forth. So this is a very typical kind of throwback, if you will, to the Mao period. So the lack of freedom of speech still very much drives this. And so, you know, one of the big themes that we haven't really talked about yet in this conversation is the importance of civil society groups, and the importance of the fact that you're not going to succeed in any of these green goals if you don't have the people behind you. Yifei, who lives in Shanghai, had the experience of when they suddenly implemented these new recycling measures, and he could describe it best, but it was like 2 hours a day, and you have to come here, and everybody's going to inspect your bag, and eventually there's going to be facial recognition technology to make sure you're recycling correctly, and if you don't, it can hurt your social credit score, and, you know, goes on like that. And so the people became enraged. You know, rather than saying this is a good thing, we should be recycling, they looked at this as yet another intrusion by the state in their personal lives. I usually let Yifei tell that story because it's really his story, but did I tell it correctly?
Oh yeah, absolutely you did.
Yeah, so that question was inspired by something that we've already mentioned in this discussion, right? This idea of cutting with one knife, right? The 一刀切, like that resonates so much with the kind of things that Judith wrote about in Mao's War Against Nature. And it's also quite striking that same kind of militarized language was employed by authorities within China when it came to respond to the coronavirus pandemic earlier this year. And I actually assigned Judith's book to my students, and one of them drew upon that book and just news articles that were coming out of China and wrote about ways in which that kind of militarized language was used to describe the public health response in the wake of the outbreak in China in early 2020. So it's something that very much resonates, and I saw a lot of parallels in reading this book between the ways in which environmental problems are addressed now and the ways in which efforts to transform the environment were taken in the late 20th century, you might say. So the mid and late 20th century. So I think that there's a lot to think about in terms of certain approaches towards the environment that are characteristic of certain political organizations, one might say. It's a very, very interesting topic that sort of emerged through this book. Actually, so when we're talking about these sort of political topics, there is a sort of crucial opposition that runs through the book between environmental authoritarianism and authoritarian environmentalism. And this opposition in some ways frames the central argument of the book. So Yifei, could you explain the difference between those two concepts and the way that it informs what you're trying to say in the book that the two of you have written?
Sure, absolutely. Part of the reason why we think it's so important to make the distinction between environmental authoritarianism on the one hand, which we think is what's actually going on, and authoritarian environmentalism on the other hand, which we think is what a lot of Western observers want China to look like. That distinction is so important because, as I suggested earlier, there seems to be this interest in playing with the idea of using authoritarian means to accomplish environmental goals. In other words, authoritarian environmentalism. The idea is that if the end goal is noble enough, is environmental enough, is justifiable enough, then the means don't matter. And especially in light of the climate catastrophe that we're in, the environmental disasters that we're already experiencing in such intensity, a lot of people are suggesting that perhaps a temporary sacrifice of individual freedom is justifiable given the ends. That is the theory and the hypothesis. And yet we find in actuality that after our systematic review of these different developments at different scales in China and outside of China, we have seen very little authoritarian environmentalism. What we see is what we conclude in the book as environmental authoritarianism, which is using environmental means to justify the intensification of authoritarianism. In other words, environmental goals and ends may or may not translate to actual environmental benefits and environmental outcomes. We don't know. In some of the cases, we've seen a certain measure of environmental improvement. In most of the cases, we have not. And yet, across all of the cases, we have seen a consolidation and intensification of Chinese state power, whether domestically in terms of its controls of citizens, its homogenization of ethnic minorities, and its consolidation of power in all parts of the country, and overseas in terms of China's geopolitical influence and the overall political leverage that the Chinese state is gaining through these quote unquote green initiatives. And we think it's just so crucial for us to understand that difference. And going back to your earlier comment about the continuity of the Chinese political history since 1949. In Judy's earlier book, Mao's War Against Nature, it was a lot of militaristic language that were deployed to mobilize citizens, to solicit compliance, and in many ways to enforce compliance. But today, what we're documenting in terms of environmental authoritarianism is a widespread use of all sorts of technologies, surveillance technologies, citizen control technologies, social credit scores, and outside of the citizen lives, industrial actors, different factories, they're being monitored more intensively than ever. And the spread of a lot of these technical tools even outside of China. These various developments are giving the Chinese state unprecedented capacity to enforce and pursue these environmental authoritarian measures domestically and internationally.
So based on your findings in this book, I wanted to know what you think is going to be necessary for China to succeed in attaining those goals and meeting those targets?
Great question, Micah. You know, I personally just love that whole idea of China going carbon neutral by 2060. I think it's such a great goal for China, and for that matter, for any country to be pursuing. Now, in terms of achieving the goal, I think we need to pay attention to how even prior to the announcement of the goal, there has been smaller scale attempts that's limited to a certain area or limited to a certain city to pursue carbon neutrality. And we want to understand how they did it in the past. Now, what we know is, for example, in the city of Beijing, or in the case of large national events, they have been making these carbon neutrality pledges. And yet these pledges are premised on two things. One is a carbon inventory. So they try to capture the amount, the distance that the different kinds of vehicles have to drive in order to get to the conference venue. They give an estimate of that. The amount of energy that's used to heat up the stadiums or to cool down the stadiums in the summer. The amount of water that they have to supply and the plastics that's generated. So they try to do a carbon inventory for each and every of these events. Now that's part number one. You try to calculate your carbon footprint. The second part is what I think is a little more problematic, is that they then subject all of these events to the carbon cap and trade mechanism. They basically say that, you know, this event is of import to the Chinese state, and therefore you get 10 tons of carbon. If you go over your 10 tons of carbon, you have to buy more carbon credits. Now, this other event is of less import to the Chinese state. You get 2 tons of carbon. And if you have to go over, bad news, you have to buy more. Now, what that suggests to me is that overall, that's great for the environment if we're just reducing our carbon intensity and also reducing our absolute carbon outputs. Both of these goals are wonderful for the planet. But if to achieve that goal, it means that every single event or every single entity moving forward will have to be subject to this carbon cap and trade mechanism. And yet this carbon cap and trade mechanism has rather little transparency, much less accountability in terms of how these permissible emissions are allocated and how people can trade with each other. And what is the money that the state makes out of this cap and trade mechanism being reallocated into? There's rather little transparency in these regards that currently is in the world. And perhaps, you know, if the various agencies that will be charged with the responsibility of achieving this carbon neutrality goals can, moving forward, produce more transparency, produce more accountability. And just in general, we want to know how they calculate carbon. If they can be upfront about, you know, the list of activities that go into their calculus and the list of activities that they exclude from these calculations, we would want to know that. And also, how is it that one event comes to get more carbon credits than another?
And I worry also that this will give impetus to this big dam building spree that's been going on in Southwest, which is drying up the Mekong River and affecting relations with many countries across the border. So presumably it will give the hydropower lobby quite a lot of ammunition to go forward even more.
Yeah, if I could add to that real quick, I think, you know, domestically, if China achieves carbon neutrality by 2060, we certainly don't want a scenario in which China exports its carbon emissions to its Belt and Road partners in the form of, you know, energy intensive infrastructure, particularly coal-fired power plants. Once again, I still think it's totally admirable that the country is willing to commit to that goal, but still that goal should benefit everyone. It shouldn't. China's accomplishments shouldn't come at the cost of other nations.
So actually, those are all the questions that I wanted to ask, but I wanted to thank both Yifei and Judith for joining us for this interview, and also to congratulate you on the publication of a fantastic and incredibly important book.
Thank you so much, Micah.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure.